Hello, InfoPerson, this is Anton, and today we're going
Hello.
to discuss something just a little bit different. We're going
Yeah.
to discuss a military secret. And in this
Oh,
case, a
I
secret
love
military
secrets.
base that was formed by the United
Mm-hmm.
States in Greenland, whose
Oh yeah,
purpose was never officially revealed until
officiellement.
approximately 20 years ago. But
Oh
much
bien.
more specifically, we're going to
Spécifiquement,
discuss an accidental rediscovery of this
accidental
secret base by
rediscovery.
NASA scientists just a few
NASA.
weeks ago. And that's
Oh,
because this base has now been buried in the ice and it's
yeah.
practically
Ah, ben,
impossible to access. And so
vraiment.
let's talk about this in a little bit more detail and actually
Yeah,
discuss
let's
why
do
this
this,
military base
Anton.
is somewhat important for a lot of
Petrov.
different types of research,
Quintet.
especially when it comes to climatology and
That.
specifically the growth of ice shelves. And
Ice
here we're
shelf. Mm.
discussing the so-called Camp Century,
Century.
a really bizarre project from the
Mm-hmm.
1960s whose cross-section you can basically see right here. Now, if you
Okay.
want to read about this yourselves, all of the
Yeah.
documents about this are in the description below. But
Oh
in
yeah.
essence, back in the late 1950s, the
Mm-hmm.
United States Army proposed building a scientific research base pretty much in the
Yes.
middle of the ice shelf in Greenland.
In the middle
And you can
of
actually sort of find it
the...
yourself if you go to any online map, such as Google Maps,
Yeah,
and if you
Google.
basically start zooming in
Zoom.
somewhere, I guess, here maybe? Alright, this is
Zoom.
going to be really hard to find,
Yeah,
so
well,
let's just plot in the coordinates.
yeah, coordinates.
77.16 north,
Mm-hmm.
61.13 west. And
Comprends.
it's basically right here. But the
Yeah.
thing is, there are obviously no images of this camp,
Yeah, obviously.
and there are no satellite pictures of
N'est-ce
this
pas?
entire area. And
That's
even if there
good.
were any images, it would just be
Mm.
snow. And that's because the entire camp was built into the ice shelf. And there's
Starfall.
even a short documentary online that should be in the description below that
Yeah.
basically shows you how this camp was built, the
Mm-hmm.
overall layout of the camp,
A
and of course
layout.
talks a little bit more about the
Quantum
main
Galaxy
purpose.
Group.
But in this case, the actual purpose of the
Yeah.
camp was classified. And so even though
Well,
officially in the 60s, this was pitched as a scientific research base whose
yeah.
purpose was to see if we can actually create a kind of a mobile base
kind of
powered
a...
entirely by a semi-mobile nuclear
Mm-hmm.
reactor,
I
in this
see.
case what's known as PM2A, that's
Yeah.
captured in these
2A.
images. In reality, this
In
was
these
not really
images,
a
en
scientific camp,
réalité.
as much as a military outpost with a much more sinister purpose.
Oh,
And
really?
so in 1996, when all of the documents about
Hello.
this were declassified, pretty much
Mm-hmm.
everyone was surprised to discover that this was
Oh,
actually part of
I
something
see.
known as
Je
Project
vois.
Iceworm, a top secret
Ice.
program that was trying to construct a bunch of mobile
Fistouch.
nuclear missile launch
Yeah,
sites,
well.
all hidden underneath
Tu l'as vu,
Greenland ice.
Kim?
And the goal of the mission was to have up to about
Oh,
600
thank
different
you.
ICBMs hidden under ice in
Yeah,
order to
well.
survive so-called first strike if the Soviet Union
First
decides
strike,
to
huh?
launch its nuclear weapons. But
Oh.
luckily for everyone, no missiles
Mother.
have been fielded in this area for one simple reason. Turns
One
out that
simple
this area
reason.
was just not stable enough, and the
Yeah.
initial research dramatically overestimated
Je
the
vois.
stability of the ice shelf, with the army eventually
I
discovering that it was just impossible to maintain
Je
a base here
comprends.
simply because the
J'entends.
ice sheet was just
Je...
not stable,
Oh,
with the
shit.
constant risk of the ice sheet water
Yes,
flooding
I shit.
everything. For example, after just 1 year, there was a huge problem with sewage, and specifically the sewage water, recirculating back into the living quarters and
Oh,
basically
right.
making everything completely unlivable. And so between 1959
Pourquoi?
and 1967,
Deep
or
inside.
basically during the camp's operation,
Magnetic.
there was nothing but issues.
Magnets.
And you can basically read about all of this
Yeah.
from the study released in 2007
Right.
about this Project Iceworm.
Oh,
But despite of this,
54.
the base still functioned for approximately
Uh-oh.
8 years. And at the end, it consisted of 21 tunnels,
8
approximately
years, huh?
3 kilometers in length. And it was powered by a nuclear
And
reactor and even contained houses for up to about 200 soldiers
Magnetic
and storage for
field.
approximately 600 missiles.
Yeah.
So this was a huge facility. Nevertheless, by 1967, this camp
fun?
was almost entirely abandoned. It was
Oh.
just an impossible design and nothing here would work as
je vois.
intended. But because so much money was spent on building this camp, and because there was actually a lot of materials in it already, including huge amounts of
N'est-ce
fuel,
pas?
trying to recover all of this now would be
Oh, bah
even
tiens.
more expensive and even more prohibitive.
Voilà,
And so
voilà.
instead, the US government decided to basically just abandon it.
Oh.
Although they did actually recover that nuclear reactor. But
yeah.
after 8 years, pretty much everything else had to be
Oh,
left behind.
franchement.
And here we're talking
Franchement.
about thousands of tons of
Milliers de
waste,
tonnes de
and much more importantly,
possibilités.
200,000 liters of diesel fuel, lots of different polychlorinated
Je
biphenyls,
vois.
thousands of liters of wastewater and potentially a lot more stuff that's been unaccounted for.
Far
And while initially
behind.
it was not believed to be a problem,
Oh bah tiens.
mostly because of the way researchers believed back then typical ice shelves
Les
operate. They basically
croyances.
believed that all of this was going to get buried into the snow,
bah
eventually
tiens.
going deeper and deeper into the Greenland
Hello.
ice shelf, and basically becoming not a problem for
Bah tiens.
thousands and possibly even millions of years. But the reality was
Breaking
just a
news,
little bit
huh?
different. The Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland
oui.
decided to maintain a climate monitoring presence at this camp
N'est-ce
and have
pas?
been basically collecting various ice core samples for several decades.
Hmm.
And while pretty much most of their discoveries suggest the
oui.
same, for nearly 3 decades now, Greenland's
Les
ice
mêmes.
sheets have been shrinking.
Oh,
For
les
example, in
carottes.
one of the most recent studies, it was
But
discovered
wait,
that
there's
between
more.
1978 and
Existe-t-il des
today,
mondes
the
parallèles?
ice shelves in North Greenland seem to have lost up to 35% of their
mystères de
volume,
l'univers.
with 3 of them collapsing completely.
Eh bah oui,
And
tiens.
we've actually discussed some of the effects of this collapse in one of the recent videos about
ça?
the unusual tsunami that was detected in Greenland that
N'est-ce
was
pas?
like 200 meters in height. You can learn about this in one of the videos in the description.
Oh, oui.
And so the ice shelves in Greenland seem to be losing
Je
ice very
vois.
fast, which means that all of this decommissioned material
them,
at
huh?
Camp Century may
Camp
actually
Century,
become an issue
un siècle.
after all. But luckily, it's not going to be a
Mais
problem
effectivement.
anytime soon. So in 2016, for example, scientists studying this camp discovered that it seems to be buried by about 36 meters of ice already.
Ouh là,
And so in
c'est
some
beaucoup,
sense,
hein?
previous assumption was not wrong. It is
Ah.
being slowly buried by the ice.
Je
But the
vois.
same study also discovered that by
Santé
2090s,
mentale.
or basically in the next 75 years or so,
tiens.
all of this might actually reverse. And
Oh,
more
reverse.
importantly, all of this meltwater will most likely start mixing with a lot of the wastewater and eventually start
Ukraine,
seeping
huh?
out, potentially entering the oceans or any area near the base.
Yeah.
And so the question now is, of course, will this happen? And if so, when will this happen? And we
Well-
might actually have some answers really soon, just not yet. And so here's basically what happened. Back in April of 2024, researchers on top of this aircraft, the Gulfstream 3 aircraft, were using a new radar to try to probe Greenland
radar.
ice sheets. And to their surprise, they discovered a bizarre blip underneath.
Blip.
At first, it looked something like this. With a much more detailed analysis
Direct,
by
huh?
using what's known as UFSAR, or
Yeah.
Uninhabited Aerial Vehicle Synthetic
Voilà.
Aperture Radar,
Surprise,
revealing the
surprise.
entire structure underneath ice, even identifying individual structures
Under
and
pressure,
individual
huh?
hallways. And this is actually super cool because what
C'est
you're seeing
très
here
cool.
is a very detailed observation of this entire camp like
Le
we've never seen it before.
CIA.
And that's despite the fact that it's buried
Top
under
secret.
36 meters of ice. And here
Voilà,
you can
voilà,
even
voilà,
compare
voilà.
this to the historical maps to see that it
Historical,
basically
huh?
looks
Oops.
exactly the same.
Put
And so
in,
even though the point of
put
this
out.
flight was to just test this new radar, in
Bien
reality
sûr.
it uncovered something nobody expected,
Oh, bah
potentially presenting us with a really good way of not just studying the ice thickness, but also discovering a lot of other mysteries hiding under ice shelves. And more
Mystère,
importantly,
mystère.
providing us with a way to study how the ice
Oh,
changes over time,
humilité.
and thus figuring out
Garde
what might actually
second.
happen to all of this waste in Camp Century,
Ah bah tiens.
and if we have to worry about it anytime soon.
Qu'est-ce
But even
que
though there's no
des
actual
êtres comme
discovery yet,
moi?
it was still kind of fun to talk about this very bizarre, very unusual secret base built by the United States Army. And in some of the future videos, we're also going to connect some of the discoveries from this base, and of course, what we're learning about our planet by studying what happens around this base. But the samples from this base, especially the ice cores, have been used in some of the previous research, and we're actually going to discuss some of the discoveries in some of the future videos coming out really soon. So subscribe, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, come back tomorrow to learn something else, maybe support this channel on Patreon, or by joining channel membership, or maybe by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye-bye.
Bye bye. Et gratitude.